She was not supposed to survive this house. That was the arrangement. Though no one had ever said it aloud, a title in exchange for a body already halfway into the ground. A husband who signed his name and rode away before the ink was even dry. She was supposed to be a quiet line in a ledger, a brief, forgettable expense. And for one entire winter, she very nearly obliged them all. But nobody in that church, least of all the man who left her standing in the mud, understood what a woman with nothing left to lose is actually capable of building. This is not a story about a duke saving a dying girl. Stay close, because it never once goes the way you expect. And by the time you understand what really happened at Oakhaven, you'll wonder how anyone ever believed she needed saving at all. 3 years is a long time to build something out of nothing. It is also a long time to wait for a man to notice you've done it. Beatrice had stopped counting the months somewhere around the second winter, because counting made the waiting feel deliberate, and she had told herself, over and over, in the particular stubborn way of someone lying to their own reflection, that she was not waiting at all. She had a house. She had a garden that fed her, servants who had become the only family she had left, and a body that no longer betrayed her quite so often. She did not need a duke to make any of that true. She had built it herself, in the dirt, on her knees, with lungs that were never supposed to last this long. She would tell you, if you asked her plainly, that she'd made her peace with it. She would be lying, and some small, watchful part of her knew it even as she said it. Because peace does not go still like a held breath the instant a stranger's footsteps start moving down your corridor. Whatever this was, it was not peace. Keep that in mind, because it matters for what comes next. Beatrice heard the boots before she heard anything else. Not Thomas's boots, which dragged on the left heel, where he'd never bothered to fix the sole. Not Mrs. Gable's brisk, apologetic little steps. These were heavier, certain. They moved down the corridor of her house like they had every right to be there, and God help her they did. She set down her quill. She did not stand. 3 years she had waited for this sound, and told herself she wasn't waiting at all. And now that it had finally come, her whole body had gone perfectly, dangerously still, the way it used to go still, before a coughing fit she couldn't stop. Whoever owned those boots was about to open her office door, and she had absolutely no idea, after everything she had built with her own 2 ruined hands, whether she was about to lose all of it. She should tell you how she got here, or none of this will make sense. Stay with her. It gets worse before it gets better. It always does. 4 years earlier, the ink on the parish register had taken an agonizing while to dry. Henry Harrington, Duke of Ashbourne, had stared down at his own signature as though it belonged to a stranger. Beside it, hers trembled, Beatrice Linfield, and as of 3 minutes prior, Beatrice Harrington, for whatever that name would come to mean. The church was empty save for the priest, her father, and a cold November draft rattling the stained glass. No flowers, no music. Her father needed £50,000 to keep his creditors from picking his estate apart bone by bone. Henry needed a wife to satisfy a clause in his late father's will before he could take up his commission in Prussia. It was not a wedding, it was an exchange of goods. And Beatrice had understood, standing there in her mother's altered gray traveling gown, that she was the good being exchanged. She had looked at him once, properly, in that church. A tall man with an unreadable face, already thinking of something else. She'd pressed her handkerchief to her mouth and coughed until her shoulders shook, and her father had looked away as though her lungs were an indiscretion. Henry had simply watched her, the way a man watches weather he cannot change. He did not hate her. That would have required noticing her. "The carriage is waiting," he'd said, and she had followed him out into her new life without a single word of protest, because protest required breath she didn't have to spare. The journey north to Oakhaven took 10 hours in near total silence, Henry reading dispatches, Beatrice shivering under a lap robe that smelled of mildew. When the manor finally rose out of the dusk, it looked less like a home than a rotting tooth against the sky, ivy strangling the stone, half the windows dark. He didn't offer his hand down from the carriage. His mind, she would later understand, was already 300 miles away, calculating the road back to London. "Mrs. Gable will show you to your quarters," he told her, barely glancing at the house he owned and had clearly already forgotten. "I ride for the coast at dawn." "How long will you be away?" "As long as the Crown requires." He looked down at her then, really looked, and something crossed his face, not tenderness, she decided later, just the cold arithmetic of a man doing sums. The doctors had given her a year, maybe less, if the winter came in hard. "The air here is good for the constitution," he said. "I trust you'll find peace." It was, she understood even then, a polite way of telling her to die quietly and not trouble anyone with the details. He was gone before the rain started in earnest. She stood in the mud and watched him go, and she did not cry, because crying required air, and she had none to spare. She would remember, years later, the exact sound his horse's hooves made striking the wet gravel, fading, then gone, and how strange it was that a man could leave a woman standing in front of her own front door and somehow take the house with him anyway. She had not always been this quiet. There had been a version of Beatrice Linfield, once, before the coughing started in earnest, who argued with her governess and laughed too loudly at her own jokes and had opinions about things that didn't concern her. That girl had drowned quietly somewhere in London, under doctor's visits and her father's mounting debts, until all that was left was this, a body that betrayed her and a title that didn't. She thought, watching the gates swallow her new husband whole, that she might simply finish what the sickness had started. It would be easier, tidier. And then she thought of her father's face in the church, embarrassed by her cough, as though it were a stain on his coat, and something small and mean and stubborn woke up in her chest instead. She did not know yet that it would save her life. She only knew, standing there in the freezing dark, that she was too angry to die that particular night. The house swallowed her. Mrs. Gable led her through corridors draped in dust sheets that smelled of cold ash and rot, apologizing for fires that wouldn't draw, and a master suite that had only been aired the day before. Beatrice sat on the edge of a bed big enough for 6 people and understood exactly what her husband thought of her. A broken thing, purchased for a title, deposited in a ruin to expire, without inconveniencing anyone. She pulled the thin blankets to her chin and let the fever take her, because there was, that first night, nothing else to do. It very nearly did take her. The winter came in hard, just as she'd feared, burying Oakhaven under snow that howled through loose window panes and found every gap in her defenses. By January, she was delirious, her skin fire, her mind ash, coughing until she tasted copper. Mrs. Gable and the 2 remaining servants, Thomas, a groundsman with more patience than words, and Mary, a scullery maid barely out of girlhood, tended her with the grim, practiced detachment of people who had watched the wasting sickness take others before her. They kept a weak fire going. They spooned broth past her cracked lips and waited for the morning they would find her cold. That morning never came. There were nights that winter she surfaced just enough to hear them talking about her, over her own bed, low and resigned, The way people discuss a leaking roof they've given up trying to fix. Thomas, asking whether he ought to write to the solicitor now or wait until it was certain. Mrs. Gable saying it was kinder to wait. Beatrice, floating somewhere just beneath the surface of her own skin, remembered thinking, with the strange clarity fever sometimes grants, that she agreed with neither of them, and that she did not much care to be discussed, as though she were already furniture. She had no strength to say so. She filed the thought away, instead, the way she would come to file so many things in that house. For later, for when she was strong enough to make it matter. Sometime in late February, the fever broke, and Beatrice woke to find her mind entirely, terribly clear. She lay listening to the rattle of the loose window frame, feeling the damp reach into her bones, and something in her went white-hot and simple. She was not going to die in this room, not waiting for a husband who had already filed her under casualties of convenience. "Mrs. Gable," she rasped, and when the housekeeper startled awake by the dying fire, Beatrice said the only thing she had strength left to say, "Get me out of this bed, and out of this room." It took 2 days, leaning on Mary's shoulder the whole way, to find what she wanted. A smaller room on the ground floor, south-facing, with oak paneling that trapped heat and a hearth that actually drew. "This isn't fit for a duchess," Mrs. Gable protested. "I don't need a duchess's room," Beatrice told her, gripping the doorframe to stay upright. "I need a room that isn't actively trying to murder me." That was the turning point, though she didn't know it yet. Don't look away now. This is where she stops being the girl in the story and starts writing it herself. She stopped playing the dying bride and started acting like a woman with a house to run, however small her portion of it. She went through the ledgers and found the previous management's waste everywhere. Polish for silver no one used, candles for rooms no one entered. She cut it without sentiment. She ordered the east and west wings boarded and their pipes drained. "We're heating too much empty space," she told Thomas, from her chair by a fire that finally, properly roared. "Use what we save on seasoned wood. I want fires burning in the rooms we actually live in, day and night." The servants were startled. For the first time in decades, Oakhaven had a mistress who cared whether the draft under the door froze anyone to death. Spring cracked the frozen ground open, and Beatrice went outside for the first time in months. She found the old kitchen garden strangled in briars. She didn't send for a landscape architect or order roses for show. She sent to the village for thyme, rosemary, mint, lungwort, mullein, plants with a purpose. At first she could manage 10 minutes on a bench watching Thomas clear the weeds. Then she was kneeling in the dirt herself, her skirts ruined, a single stubborn root, sometimes triggering a coughing fit that left her gasping in the grass for half an hour. She refused to stop. The smell of wet, turned earth felt like an antidote to every stale, dust-choked room she'd been left to rot in. "You'll catch your death out here, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable fretted, bringing a shawl she didn't ask for. "I'm catching my life, Mrs. Gable," Beatrice said, and meant it. She wasn't cured. The rattle in her chest never fully left her, and some mornings the weather turned and she couldn't leave the bed at all. But she was no longer fading, and there is a particular, fierce satisfaction in that distinction that only someone who has been fading truly understands. She brewed her own teas. She had the blacksmith fix the kitchen range until the whole house smelled of baking bread instead of mildew. She read agricultural texts by the fire in the evenings, wrapped in a blanket, and stopped waiting for letters that came, thinner and further apart. The first time she rode into the village herself, that autumn, She did it against Mrs. Gable's fretting and her own better judgment, sitting stiff and upright in the cart beside Thomas, a basket of dried herbs balanced on her knees to sell at the market stalls. The villagers had heard, of course, that the Duke had left his dying wife alone at Oakhaven. Everyone within 20 miles had heard that, and she felt their eyes on her the whole way down the high street, curious and a little pitying, waiting, she suspected, for her to prove them right and collapse in the road. She didn't. She sold every bundle of rosemary and mullein by noon, haggled a fair price out of a butcher twice her size who'd tried to shortchange her, and rode home with coin in her pocket and her spine a little straighter than when she'd left. It was a small thing. It was the first time in her life anyone had paid her for something she'd grown with her own hands, and she found she liked the feeling more than she'd liked anything London had ever offered her in a ballroom. By the second year the letters stopped altogether, though the money kept arriving, quarterly, like a debt being paid off rather than a marriage being tended. She heard from the village that her husband was in Vienna, then Russia, then Spain, negotiating treaties, surviving what people whispered were assassination attempts. He became, to her, a character in a novel she wasn't reading anymore. Her reality was the ripeness of August tomatoes and the firewood stacked for November, and the quiet, unglamorous loyalty of 3 servants who had become, in every way that mattered, her family. She had taken an empty, rotting shell and filled it with warmth. She hadn't needed a husband to do it. She'd built herself a home instead. Which brings her back to the boots in the corridor, 3 years on, and a door easing open on a man she had genuinely, finally, stopped expecting. She looked up from the estate ledgers first at Thomas, who scrambled his cap off and bowed so fast he nearly knocked over the ink. Then she looked at the doorway, and there he was, Henry Harrington, Duke of Ashbourne, older around the eyes than the man who'd ridden off into the rain, his posture still soldier straight, but his face gray with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with the road. 3 years, and this was how he found her. Sleeves pushed to her elbows, hair escaping a knot she hadn't bothered to fix since dawn, ink staining the side of her hand, dirt still under her nails from the morning's planting. She did not gasp. She did not swoon. She simply looked at him the way she'd learned to look at every unexpected problem the estate had thrown at her, measuring, calculating, already 3 steps ahead. "You're alive," Henry said, blunt, stupid, an accusation flung at reality itself for not matching what he'd prepared for. She reached for the handkerchief on the desk out of old habit and didn't cough. She noticed him noticing that. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Your Grace," she said, and her voice came out smooth and cold and entirely without the wet rattle that used to break every second word. "I realize a widow's weeds would have been considerably less trouble for you." He flinched at that. She saw it, small and real, and felt a savage little flicker of satisfaction that she wasn't proud of and didn't regret. He stepped further into the room, and she watched him take in the ledgers, the neat stacks of receipts, the whole quiet machinery of a house he no longer recognized. "I expected ruins," he said, and something in his voice had dropped the diplomat's polish entirely. He was too tired, it seemed, for lies. "You left ruins," she answered. "I simply refused to be buried under them." He asked for a room. She told him the east wing was boarded and gave him the blue chamber near her own parlor, because the chimney stack was shared and the fire drew well there. Practicality, she told herself, nothing more, though some small, unguarded part of her noted that she'd chosen to put him close. "Don't get comfortable yet!" She certainly didn't, but watch what happens the very next morning. because that's when he learned exactly how far outside his own house he'd put himself. Dinner that first night was a spare, utilitarian affair in the little breakfast parlor near the kitchens. Stoneware instead of his ancestors' porcelain, ironware instead of silver, a cheap red from the village instead of imported claret. She watched him eat heavy oat bread without complaint, and felt an old, familiar wariness refuse to loosen in her chest. "I reorganized a mausoleum into a home," she told him, when he observed, not unkindly, that she'd reorganized his household completely. "If you'd prefer the grandeur of freezing to death in the master suite, I can have Thomas unlock it tomorrow. You'll fetch your own firewood. The blue chamber will be fine," he said, and something crossed his eyes, surprise, gone as quickly as it came, that she filed away without knowing quite what to do with it. The next morning taught him his place faster than she could have. He went to order Thomas to saddle his bay so he could ride the boundaries, and Thomas, mallet still resting against his knee, glanced nervously toward her office window and said he'd have to check with her Grace first. She'd wanted the wagon axle fixed before noon to get the winter squash to market. A sharp reprimand rose in Henry, she'd learn later, the pure reflex of a man whose orders had never once been questioned by a groundsman. He swallowed it. He looked at the lantern glowing behind her window and understood, all at once, exactly what he'd abandoned and exactly who had saved it. He saddled his own horse that morning. It was, in its small and humiliating way, the first true thing he did at Oakhaven. She caught him 3 days later going through her ledgers when he thought she was in the garden, tracing the columns with the critical eye of a man expecting to find a widow's chaos, and finding instead ruthless, unsentimental mathematics. Pastures leased for a cut of wool and meat instead of wages she couldn't pay. Ornamental lead sold off a dead fountain to patch the roof. "If you're looking for missing funds," she said from the doorway, a basket of thyme on her arm and mud caked to her boots, "you won't find them." She told him plainly what Oakhaven could and couldn't support. No valets, no footmen. A coat left on the floor stayed on the floor. "I've spent 2 years sleeping in canvas tents, eating salted pork that tasted of gunpowder," he told her, low. "I don't require a valet." She studied his face for the lie, and infuriatingly found none. "Then stay out of my way," she said, and walked out before he could see what that cost her to say. He kept his word, mostly. He chopped wood. He fixed hinges Thomas couldn't lift alone. He rode the estate's boundaries and noted, silently, every repair she'd prioritized and every one she'd been forced to let go for lack of coin. He learned, without her ever explaining it, the rhythm of her illness. That damp mornings were the worst, that she'd sit in her parlor drinking foul mullein tea until the dew burned off the grass, that pushing too hard brought a dangerous flush to her cheeks and a cough like tearing silk. He never once told her to rest. She noticed that too, and didn't know what to do with it either. The truce nearly held. Then a letter arrived from the neighboring landowner, and everything he'd stayed carefully out of, he walked straight into. She was still furious when Henry found her. Lord Danvers had dammed the lower stream to make himself a private fishing pond, and his reply to her 2 formal letters had been to pat her, in flowery, condescending script, on the head, and remind her a woman could hardly be expected to understand centuries-old property law. "The mill will run dry by August," she told Henry, shoving the letter across the desk, too angry to care that she was asking him for anything at all. He read it twice. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. The kind, she'd learn, that had once made a French ambassador physically recoil at a peace summit. "You're dealing with this the wrong way," he said, and took up her quill before she could object. He didn't threaten a lawsuit. He wrote Danvers a note of exquisite, deadly politeness, informing him the Duke of Ashbourne had returned to residence and was very much looking forward to discussing Danvers's recent, highly irregular tax assessments in the House of Lords, with a cheerful postscript inquiring after a nephew whose gambling debts Henry had, conveniently, purchased before he'd left for the continent. Thomas wrote it over. 2 hours later, he came back with a stammering, panicked apology and a promise the dam would be gone by nightfall. That was blackmail, she said, watching Henry calmly clean mud from his boots. That was diplomacy, he corrected, not looking up. And for the first time since he'd walked back into her house, the air between them didn't feel weaponized. It felt, she thought, unsettled by the thought, even as she had it, like a shared trench. You built the mill, he told her quietly. I merely protected the water. She said thank you and meant it, and told herself that was all it was. She should have known better. The weather was already turning, and it wasn't finished with either of them yet. 3 days later, the sky broke open in a freezing, unseasonal storm, and Beatrice, checking on an overflowing drainage ditch in the herb garden she'd built with her own hands, found herself kneeling in the mud, unable to breathe. Not coughing, suffocating, her lungs filling with fluid and cold faster than she could fight it, the spade falling from fingers that had gone numb, her chest convulsing around air that wouldn't come. She heard, distantly, someone shouting her name, and then she was being lifted, weightless as wet twigs, against a chest that smelled of rain and horse, and something warmer underneath. She fought him blind for one panicked second, before her head fell against his shoulder, and the world narrowed to the terrifying blue, creeping into her own vision. He carried her straight to her parlor, kicking the door open, roaring for hot bricks and towels, with the flat, absolute authority of a man used to being obeyed on a battlefield. His hands shook even as his movements stayed precise, stripping the soaked outer layers, wrapping her in dry blankets, packing hot stones around her, while Mrs. Gable rushed in with a warming pan. He pulled her upright against his own chest and held her there, his mouth pressed to her wet hair. Breathe, he said, low, over and over, like the word alone could do it for her. I have you. You're all right. She coughed something wet and terrible that rattled against his ribs, and slowly, held against the heat of him, the blue faded from her lips, and she let herself go slack against a man she had sworn, 3 years running, that she didn't need. She survived it, but it grounded her for a week, and in that week, Henry became her shadow in a way she'd never let anyone be. He moved his ledgers into her parlor without asking. He took over the estate correspondence. When the coughing woke her at 2 a.m, she'd open her eyes to find him already in the chair by the hearth, stoking the fire, a cup of bitter tea sliding onto the table by her bed before she'd even asked. He never hovered. He never pitied her. He simply held the walls while she rebuilt her strength behind them, and it unnerved her more than anything else he'd done, because she had built her entire survival on the certainty that she needed no one, and here she was, listening for his boots in the corridor, missing him the second he left the room. She thought she was the only one in that house still fighting a war nobody could see. She was wrong, and the storm that proved it came at the end of April. She was finally strong enough to sit up with a book on crop rotation when the thunder came back, not rolling this time, but cracking like artillery, hard enough to shake dust loose from the rafters. She waited for Henry to check the windows, as he'd taken to doing every time the weather turned. He didn't come. Instead, She heard a low, guttural gasp through the wall, and then furniture crashing to the floor. Every instinct told her to call for the servants. She didn't. She knew, without knowing how she knew, that he would never forgive being seen like this by anyone but her. She found him backed into the corner of the blue chamber in his shirt sleeves, bare feet on the cold boards, his eyes wide and unseeing, fixed on the rain-lashed window as though it were grape-shot. "Hold the line," he was whispering, voice cracked open, nothing left of its usual command. "Hold the line, damn you, they're coming through the smoke." She had spent 3 years resenting his absence and imagining champagne and grand ballrooms. She had never once pictured the actual, bloody mechanics of what he'd been doing instead. She didn't rush him. She made her footsteps loud on purpose, said his name low and even, the same tone she'd use on a spooked horse. And when he turned on her with a stranger's violence in his eyes, not recognizing her at all, she lowered herself slowly to the cold floor in front of him, putting herself beneath his eyeline, making herself small and harmless and known. "The artillery is gone," she told him. "It's rain on the glass. You're in Yorkshire. You're at Oakhaven." His breathing was as ragged as hers on her worst days. "Look at me," she said, firmer now. "I am Beatrice. Look at the stones. Look at the hearth. You are home." Something in him fractured and gave way. He looked at his own shaking hands, and then at her, sitting on the freezing floor in her nightgown, refusing to look away, and he covered his face and made a sound she'd never heard a grown man make, the sound of someone who has carried far too much, for far too long, finally setting it down. She crossed the floor and put her hand flat between his shoulder blades and simply left it there, a tether, proof he wasn't falling alone. When the storm finally rolled away, he told her, in a voice scraped hollow, about a cavalry charge outside Leipzig. Fog too thick, a miscalculated flank, 400 men riding into a marsh that swallowed them whole. "The mud looked like blood," he said. "I dream about the mud." She didn't offer him comfort that would have insulted the weight of it. She got up instead, righted the overturned chair, coaxed the dying fire back to a proper blaze. "The mud here is just mud," she told him. "It grows rosemary. It grows time. It ruins my skirts. It doesn't bleed, Henry." She held out her hand. "Get up off the floor. You'll catch a chill, and I refuse to nurse you when I have a mill to repair." He took it. Her grip was small, and it held his whole weight anyway. Summer, when it finally came, baked the dampness out of the house, and was kinder to her lungs than any winter had ever been. A full month, once, without the taste of copper in her throat. Henry didn't watch the harvest from the shade. He stripped his fine coats, rolled his sleeves, and worked the fields beside Thomas, hauling grain sacks and blistering his hands on a scythe, until the villagers who'd first regarded their returned duke with terrified deference began to look at him instead with something like respect. Men who sweated in the dirt didn't need titles to prove themselves. She watched him from her table in the courtyard, a straw hat shielding her face, tallying yields and paying seasonal hands from an iron lockbox, and told herself she was only watching the numbers. It was not, she noted with some irritation at herself, a very convincing lie. She noticed the way the younger village girls found excuses to walk past the lower field at midday. She noticed, with less pride than she'd like to admit, that she noticed it at all. There was a version of this summer, she thought, in which she might have hated him for it, for being effortlessly, infuriatingly good at the one thing she had spent 3 years learning by trial and blistered hands. Instead, she found herself keeping a second tally alongside the wool and the barley, a private one, of small things she hadn't asked for and didn't know what to do with. The way he always left the last of the water jug for her without being asked. The way he'd started calling Thomas by his given name instead of the groundsman. The low, unguarded sound of his laugh the one afternoon a lamb got loose in the kitchen garden and flattened 3 rows of her lungwort, chasing it. She had not heard him laugh once in the 4 years she'd known him before that summer. She caught herself listening for it after that, the way she used to listen for his boots in the corridor, and told herself, again, less convincingly each time, that it meant nothing at all. One August evening, the courtyard finally emptied, and she sat alone at her ledgers, dangerously fatigued, when a shadow fell over the columns she couldn't focus on anymore. He set a tin cup of cold well water down over the numbers. "The math will still be there tomorrow," he said, and pulled up a stool across from her, forearms streaked with dirt and chaff, smelling of sweat and horses. "We outpaced last year's yield by 30%, she told him anyway, because talking about the harvest was safer than talking about anything else. He told her to save the coal money and let the West Wing rot. His peers, he said, would take one look at his hands now and think him mad, and he found he didn't much care. "You look well, Beatrice," he said, quiet, no polish on it at all, just fact, and something in her chest that had been braced for 3 years, finally, dangerously, loosened. "I am surviving," she said. "You are leading," he corrected, and reached across the table and laid his rough, calloused hand over hers, trapping the tin cup between them. She didn't pull away. She turned her hand and laced her fingers through his instead, and they sat together in the dark, 2 battered people holding on. And for a while, the story wants you to think it's that simple. It isn't. The world outside those walls hadn't forgotten either of them, and it was already riding north. It arrived in November, 4 years to the day after their wedding, in the shape of hoofbeats too fast and too sharp to be Thomas's cart horse. Beatrice was in the kitchen curing winter hams when she heard it, and she knew, some old cold instinct knew, exactly what was coming before she ever saw the royal courier's blue and gold livery on her front steps. Henry took the heavy, sovereign-sealed envelope, without breaking the wax. She watched the color drain out of his face at the sight of the crest, watched him drag back into himself, cold and calculating, the man she'd first married in an empty church. "Thomas will show you to the kitchens," he told the exhausted courier, flat, and shut the door. He stood in the foyer holding that letter like a dead weight, and Beatrice felt something in her own chest turn to stone. This was the part of the story she had always known was coming, even in the months she'd let herself forget it. The part where the crown remembered it owned him and came to collect. She had built Oakhaven out of the wreckage of a marriage she'd never wanted, and somewhere in the last year, without ever quite deciding to, she had let it become something she did want. That was the danger of it. That was always going to be the danger of it. A man like the Duke of Ashbourne was never allowed to vanish into the Yorkshire hills forever. He was a weapon, and the crown had come to collect its arsenal. Every wall she'd let down over the summer slammed back up at once, because if she felt nothing, his leaving couldn't break her. "I'll have Mrs. Gable prepare your trunks," she heard herself say, flat as the housekeeper she was pretending to be, not the wife. "The roads will be treacherous by next week. You should leave at dawn." His head snapped toward her. "You don't even know what it says." "It says they need you," she said, untying her apron, refusing to look at him. "Your duty is to the crown. You've played farmer for a season. Your conscience is clear, you're free to go." She turned toward the kitchens, already calculating in her head how she'd cover the wood chopping without him, already bracing for the ledgers to get harder again, and he crossed the foyer in 3 strides and caught her arm before she could take a second step. "Stop," he said. She turned on him, furious, defended. "Let go of me. You have a carriage to pack." He didn't let go. Instead, he walked to the drawing room hearth, the letter still unopened in his fist, and threw it straight into the fire. She gasped, actually stepped forward, certain he'd lost his mind entirely. That was a royal dispatch, but he only watched the wax blacken and curl, and when he turned back to her, the diplomat's mask had burned off with it. "I spent my whole adult life trading pieces of my soul to keep kings on their thrones," he said, his voice filling the quiet hall. "I ordered men into the mud for borders that changed within the week. I gave the crown my youth, my peace of mind, and very nearly my sanity. I am not going back to London. I am not going back to the balls, and I am not going back to the slaughter. I don't care if the whole continent burns." Her breath caught. Whatever wall she'd built in the last 5 minutes was already coming down, faster than she could stop it. "Henry, they'll strip your commissions. They'll call you a coward. Let them." He closed the distance between them, framed her face in 2 rough, calloused hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones like he was memorizing them. "I left a dying girl in a tomb because I was a coward. I came home looking for a grave, Beatrice, and I found a queen ruling a fortress instead. You built this out of dirt and sheer, stubborn defiance. You saved my estate, and then you saved me." Her throat tightened around a cough that never came, tears rising instead, hot and entirely unplanned. "I'm still sick, Henry. The winters will always be hard. I can't promise you I won't." She couldn't finish it. "I don't want a promise of forever," he said, forehead dropping against hers. "I want today. I want tomorrow. I want to freeze in the mud, with you trying to save the barley. This is my home, Beatrice. You are my home, and I am never leaving you in it alone again." She let go, finally, of the last of the armor she'd spent 3 years welding shut, and pressed her whole weight against him, and he held her like a man who had found, at the end of every road he'd ever ridden, exactly the one place he was supposed to be. The house around them smelled of rosemary and wood smoke, fierce and alive, and entirely, finally whole. But here's the question worth sitting with, if you've made it this far. He burned a royal summons for her. What happens the next time the crown doesn't send a letter, and simply sends soldiers instead? Tell me in the comments what you think Henry does when they come for him twice,